Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring the dynamics of a cult I've recently joined. Now, before you get overly concerned about my state of mind, don't worry. It's a cult that I know a number of you already belong to. And some of you that aren't involved in it are involved in even more extreme versions of it than the one I'm in. So what am I talking about? Don't worry, the answer isn't anything mind-bending or extreme. What I'm talking about here is Peloton. For those of you unfamiliar with it, Peloton is an indoor spin bike that comes with a screen which allows you to stream live and on-demand classes into your home. In simple terms, it's like going to the gym for a cycling class, but it happens at home via video. The bikes are only available in the US, Canada, the UK and Germany, and they'll soon be arriving in Australia. So some of you may not have heard of this. If you haven't, there's a link to Peloton's website in the show notes. The reason I'm exploring Peloton is that it provides some fascinating insights into human decision making. Because on the face of it, the idea of a cycling spin class at home seems a bit odd. And the cult-like enthusiasm of owners like me, well, isn't exactly what you might call normal. And before buying one, I was incredibly skeptical, particularly as I wasn't someone who was naturally drawn to going to exercise classes. So the idea of doing it at home didn't really seem that appealing. But having seen Peloton bikes widely advertised and hearing from a number of friends how much they loved the product, my partner and I decided to buy one. And let me tell you that I'm loving it, doing far more exercise than ever before. And the cultish things that had put me off are actually part of the reason it's really engaged me. So I wanted to find out what the hell was happening and how this idea that initially seemed so illogical to me has turned out to be so effective. The answer, of course, is that it uses behavioural science. And I think there are some lessons here for other contexts in which we might want to persuade people who aren't naturally drawn towards something to do it. Like, for example, getting people to follow compliance requirements. Now, I know that as well as listeners who are Peloton owners, there will be some of you that have never heard of it, some who hate the idea. I get that. I was one of you once. And of course, the cycling fundamentalists who think it's not the real thing at all. But whatever your perception, stick with me, because there's a valuable lesson here about understanding how humans make decisions. Something that seems odd to you might not to someone else. And it might not be odd to you if you knew more about it. So what I wanted to do was understand why Peloton was so successful as a means of illustrating how we can influence others and ourselves. And rather than try and work it out for myself, I thought I'd see if someone else had researched the subject. And they had. My guest on this episode, Lisa Richardson, who is of course a Peloton rider, undertook some research into why Peloton is so effectively able to engage customers. For those of you in marketing, it has a net promoter score of 94. In other words, 94% of its customers would recommend it to a colleague or friend. That's an astonishingly high number for any product. Lisa's research is entitled Peloton as a Facilitator of Hope, and it explores the factors that drive user engagement with the product. Before we begin, I'll just state something that I hope is obvious. This episode isn't sponsored or endorsed by Peloton. Neither Lisa nor I have been paid in any way to promote it. We just love the product. So with those caveats out of the way, let's explore a subject that I think is fascinating. Please enjoy my discussion with Lisa Richardson on Peloton. Lisa, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And look, I know who you are, but many of my listeners might not. So can you give them a little bit of sense of who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. So, relevant to the topic of today's conversation, I completed a research study looking at the Peloton experience and really trying to understand what's happening and why are people kind of around the world who are getting into Peloton having these kind of big aha moments and saying things like, I'm hooked on this thing, I'm addicted to this thing, Peloton changed my life. And so I completed a master's degree in positive psychology. And as I was really learning about that, kind of kept connecting things back to Peloton. And so I am a positive psychologist, and what that means is really looking at examples like Peloton and trying to figure out what's happening there, why does it work, and how can we use examples like that to increase well-being for individuals and communities in kind of more applied ways outside of just academia. On the outside of that, I work at a startup here in Denver and work on communications, but I'm really passionate about kind of improving individual and collective well-being.
Amazing. And so very simple terms, you bought a Peloton some time ago, and clearly you didn't return it within the 30 days that you have to, kept hold of it, really liked it, and then recognized that some of the things that you were feeling towards it and the not just the bike but the experience were things that were relevant to what you were looking at in your masters. And so you thought, I'm going to pull these things together and just work out what the hell is going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, what really kind of drew me into this, and to tell you some of the backstory, I bought a Peloton in 2015, so kind of an early adopter, if you will, sight unseen, because there weren't, at the time, I live in Denver, Colorado, there weren't stores, there weren't massive, advertising campaigns, but I had taken on kind of additional responsibilities in a job that was requiring a lot of time. And I had realized over, the several years before with work, I had really kind of deprioritized my own fitness and well-being, and said, you know what, if I'm going to take the leap into this new path and this new career opportunity, I need to do something for myself too. And so I bought the bike sight unseen, thought, I loved spinning classes before, hadn't really been making the time for it, so it would be a great thing to have in my house. So that way, when I came home from work, I could throw dinner in the oven, hop on a ride, and save a bunch of time. And flash forward, 5-6 years later, I am like just as hooked, as probably more than I thought I would have been. And so I had decided to, I navigated careers and was going through a career transition. And as I was exploring that transition, I fell into the field of positive psychology. I think in many parts because of my experience with Peloton, that this kind of experience that I had through Peloton and kind of focusing on well-being and kind of discovering different things really made me see the importance of that. And so I found myself kind of Googling things like organizational leadership and wellness, or organizational psychology and well-being. And I fell into the field of positive psychology, which I can explain more about what that really is. But as I was learning, I kept, like, every time I'd learn a new piece of research, I was like, well, that's like Peloton. And I think that's what's happening with Peloton. And I just couldn't shake the idea. And so that's kind of how I started to connect the two fields.
Amazing. And let's answer that point, because positive psychology, on the face of it, sounds obvious, but what is it?
Yeah, absolutely. So positive psychology was initiated about 20 years ago at the University of Pennsylvania when Martin Seligman, who's kind of, the founding face of positive psychology, along with many others, kind of initiated this call to action to say, you know what? Traditional psychology is obviously incredibly important. It focuses on identifying kind of the negative experiences that individuals have throughout their life and the impacts of those, and then identifying strategies to alleviate those symptoms and to kind of get people back to almost like a baseline of zero, if you were to put it on a number line. And he said, well, what else is happening in life? What about all these really good things and kind of the other side of the number line? And so there was this call to action to say, how do we better understand individual strengths and kind of the things that make life worth living in a way? And so the field is, kind of initiated a lot of different academic studies and research focusing on things like positive emotions and well-being, and how do we increase joy and kind of overall satisfaction with life. And what I really loved about the field is there is this push to say, this is important enough that we need to think about how do we apply this in our organizations, in our personal lives, and in all sorts of different pursuits. And so there's this really focus on the applied aspect of it and making sure that it doesn't just live in papers that don't kind of come to life. And so that's kind of the background of what positive psychology is. And there's many frameworks that then you can connect to kind of different experiences that you've had, if that makes sense.
And so this is about, rather than understanding what makes us sad, miserable, and so on, so this is about what makes us happy, and how can we, I guess, in very simple terms, how can we bottle that in a way and kind of deploy that to get the best out of people and to make people's lives more improved lives, I guess, in a general sense. And so you're studying this, and you've recognized that a lot of these things that you've been studying about, you have been feeling as you've been going through this Peloton experience. And so you were like, I want to put those two things together. And so how did you go about studying this subject?
Yeah, great question. So I think it'll be helpful. One of the kind of key frameworks that was initiated with positive psychology, and there's now, candidly, many ways of identifying what makes life worth living. And there are measures that have, 50 plus, things, if you think about all the different context and environmental things that go into our life experiences, which I think are incredibly important. But one of kind of the core frameworks in the field that I think is also really tangible and easy to access for people is called PERMA. And this was one of the kind of the first frameworks to say, well, how do we prove that there are ways that we can enhance individual well-being? And so the PERMA model is an acronym, and it stands for positive emotion, P, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. And what the model has found is that by focusing on those individual domains, that not only do individuals have the ability to kind of really tap into each one of those, thinking about like, well, when do I have kind of experiences where I lose track of time and feel totally engaged in what I'm doing? Or what are the life-giving relationships that I have, and how do I prioritize focusing on those? And that when people are able to tap into these, not only do they experience kind of an overall greater sense of well-being, but it's also been tied to positive outcomes in overall life satisfaction, job satisfaction, vitality, kind of just like your overall energy towards life. And it's also been shown to be a buffer to actually decreasing distress that people experience. And so a really powerful framework. And I think it's something that I saw as I talk to individuals, that people are able to, like, it kind of clicks. It's like, oh yeah, I can think about those things. And if I were to go through my day, I can think about things that help me to experience those things. And I can also think about when I'm lacking those things, how that makes me feel. And I think especially if we think about the past year and a half or so in the face of the pandemic, when we're missing some of those things, it has a real impact on how we feel. And so as I started to learn about this model and really kind of tap into the questions for myself personally of when do I feel those things, many times I was like, well, when I'm on the Peloton, right? Like I have this sense of achievement. I feel like proud of what I've accomplished, or maybe, I see growth in my, metrics that I'm tracking, or I feel this sense of, positive emotion where I just feel better after I get off of which I know physical activity, we know that there are lots of benefits, but there's also like relationships. There's people that I talk to about this, and it makes me feel connected to them, or even engaging with the instructors in different ways through social media. And so I just kept like kind of clicking back to these frameworks and these models that have been, validated to say these are important parts of our life, to say Peloton is actually cultivating this in many ways. And as I talk to other people who had Pelotons, they're like, yeah, that makes sense. And so, as I said, I wanted to better understand that. And so I kicked off a research study with, it was voluntary for people who had a bike. I focused just on the bike, just for context. It was just an easier, kind of narrower focus. And asked people to answer a bunch of questions about kind of their experience, looking at everything from why they initially purchased the bike, to how they feel now and what keeps them motivated to use the bike, and looking at the individual features that kind of allow that to happen. Because I think, as I know you've mentioned, there's something that like you watch this experience and it's almost like there has to be something behind this. Like this isn't just that I'm working out. Like what are the things that are actually unlocking this experience? And so I was looking to explore that in this study.
It's a very simple terms. It's a survey of people, and you looked at people that had it for a certain amount of time. So this wasn't, I've just got this, I'm very excited about time. And you asked them a series of questions about the reasons for buying it, their experiences. And so what did you discover?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot of things, and there's a lot of things that also, you have this database of all these different rabbit holes that you can go down, and how do you slice and dice the data. But a few things that really stuck out to me. And I think before I answer this, I'd be curious just asking you, as a Peloton user, like, why did you buy the bike? Because I think that was one of the first things that I asked people.
Right. So I probably wouldn't qualify for the survey on the basis it's early days, but
yeah,
I'm obsessed enough by it. So it's actually my partner bought it, but we had a discussion about it, and it was kind of, I think we had been bombarded by advertisements, and because they were running massive amounts of campaigns here in the UK, and I knew a few people that had them. And it just got to a point where I think we were kind of like, well, let's just give this a go because you can return it if you don't like it. And so very clever ways of sucking in.
Yeah.
And the people that I spoke to about it were so like positively engaged and loved it that I kind of thought this has got to be worth trying. And so we just agreed that we would get one and see what happened. And I think both of us recognized we weren't doing enough exercise. So it's kind of like, what's the downside, right? The worst case scenario is this thing goes back. Best case scenario is it makes us do some exercise. But it's gone way beyond that for me.
Sure, absolutely. And I think the reason why I asked that is because that's very similar to, I think, what many people said. Most people mentioned this big theme, and one of the first things that I discovered was that like convenience was a huge motivator. And whether that was convenience because you're like, I see this as a way of like, I haven't been working out as much as I should be, so maybe this is going to help me to do that. Or other people I know seem pretty like excited about this, so maybe it'll work for me. And then a big factor, as you can imagine, whether it's in light of restrictions because of COVID-19, it was a safe way for people to engage. But a lot of times it was like it's at home or it's going to be easy to do. And one of the another kind of research theory that I applied to where I think that finding makes a lot of sense is. There's research around hope and hope theory from Charles Snyder, and he posits that hope is not just like wishful thinking. It's not just, oh, I hope this thing will happen, but that what we really mean when we talk about hope is that we have a specific goal, something that we're trying to achieve or that we want to happen, and that we're able to identify both pathways towards that goal as well as kind of agentic actions that we can take towards that. So seeing yourself as being able to move forward. In individuals, there's lots of studies that correlate hope to, sustained motivation or success in goal attainment, because when we're able to identify pathways and see ourselves as capable, we are able to overcome challenges and setbacks and different barriers. And so as I was analyzing people's responses like your own, like, well, why did you first buy the bike? Those were kind of like the overwhelming reasons where things about like, this is a pathway towards a goal that I have. I think this will work for me. I see myself as being able to do this, and it's convenient. And so seeing that was kind of the largest motivator, I thought was really interesting. Because it's some ways very different than what people talk about, like why they keep doing it. When people say, oh my gosh, this thing maybe changed my life, they're not saying it changed my life because it was convenient. Or they're not saying, it changed my life because it's helping me to reach my goals. And so there was kind of this interesting difference of understanding what is the shift that is happening. And I thought it was really interesting when you also think about, and this might be a bit of a rabbit hole, but when we think about motivation in general, or we think about even going out in the world and trying to apply things about like positive psychology and well-being, I think there's a big piece that we need to remember. People don't like necessarily being hit over the head with like, this thing will change your life, or this is how you're going to feel when you do this. People like to know like, this is convenient and it's going to work for me. And I see that as a pathway towards that. And so that's been an interesting mindset. And I don't know if that's relevant to other topics that you explore in your conversations, to think like how we kind of initiate behavior is very different than what sustains behavior.
Right. And that's interesting in the context of this device, right? Because if you look historically, the exercise bike, lots of people buy them historically, but they tend to become kind of places to store clothes and sit in the corner of the room.
Yeah.
And so all of the purchases of this sort of device clearly were driven by an enthusiasm to try and do something. And that tends to fall away. What seems to be different here is they've taken something that historically, clearly the rationale for purchasing was always there. And there are clearly stores that have been selling these things for decades.
Yeah.
So clearly that rationale exists. What's interesting here is that they've managed to capitalize on that initial thing, but clearly made it much more popular, and people are keeping hold of them.
Yeah. It's a good point. And as I wanted to do my due diligence on this topic and make sure this wasn't just like my own personal bias of like, I'm enthusiastic about this product, let's see if other people are. I did dig into some of, Peloton's public data from their quarterly earnings. And I think the data that I pulled at the time was from, I think it was Q3 2020. So March-ish of 2020. And they had reported that 93% of their users are actively engaged with the product, which I thought was fascinating to say. These are people who, they have a subscription model. It's not just that, I think many of us get, hooked into subscriptions and don't use it, but you forget to cancel it, right? And so you're still paying for this thing. But that 93% of people are actively engaged, and they actually have data that shows year over year by cohort that individuals who are using the product actually increase their use over a year. So it's not just that I started and I was gung-ho about this product and I did it every single day and then I never did it again, but that over time their average workouts per month when you follow a cohort tended to increase. And I mean, I'm sure there's many ways that for why is that, because they've also increased, it's not just bikes, it's meditation and it's yoga and it's stretching and it's running. And so I think there's lots of things for potentially why that's happening, but I thought it made it a valid exemplar to unpack, to say, this is a model of sustained engagement. This isn't just like you said, I buy it and then it sits in my house.
What were you finding in terms of people's rationale for continuing to use it? And was that the same as the rationale that they bought it for in the first place?
Great question. And I'll to be totally honest, at first when I was looking at my data, I kind of got very alarmed, because that was one of my kind of hypotheses, was what is happening, that there's a shift in motivation. And so I, sometimes this is just survey error, but there was a question that I asked that basically said, has your motivation changed since the time that you purchased the bike? And many people said no. And my first reaction was oh my gosh, I had this hypothesis that people are more motivated than they are today, and so than they were when they bought the bike. And so my study is this isn't going to work. It's not going to prove what I'm hoping it will, or reveal what my hypothesis is. But then the follow-up question was, describe your current motivation. And so it's a more long-form qualitative response. And as I started to code those responses, people said things like, I'm more motivated. This is something I thought I would enjoy much more than I'd anticipated. I think I have a quote from one user who said, I think I would struggle more in day-to-day life if I didn't have this, because I use it to blow off steam. I feel more positive. I feel more, engaged. And so I was oh, there's something here. And I think one, and I haven't fully explored this, is, and my hunch is that we're hesitant to, the way that question was interpreted was meaning that, you having more motivation wouldn't trigger you to answer that question as yes, that somehow we perceive a change in motivation to be a negative, right? That there's some kind of underlying bias there, that if I say, has your motivation changed? You might be more inclined to say, no, I'm more motivated. And in my head, I'm well, that is a change, but you're still, your we tend to think that a change in motivation is a negative, and having that kind of bias there, which I thought was just interesting from a human component. But what I found was that, and I mentioned the PERMA model earlier, because what I did was I used a kind of validated list of words that have been used for, deep kind of data analytics studies, pulling from Twitter and using some lots of data analysis to understand what are words that are most correlated with each of the domains of PERMA. So what are words that correlate to positive emotion? What are words that, correlate to engagement, et cetera? And I ran this data through, a database using those words to try and see, is there any changes? Do we see fluctuations in the way people describe why I chose to buy the bike compared to their response on what keeps you engaged with using the bike? And there was a significant shift where I had said before, the majority of responses focused on convenience as the initial kind of motivator. It was close to, I think, like 81 responses cited something around convenience, and only, let me get the exact number, so 78% of initial users reported something around convenience, and 18% in the initial response used words related to these PERMA domains. So kind of a really low, like an interesting ratio of high correlation to convenience, low amount of words used when you think about these, like, it's going to make me feel positive, or I'm going to feel engaged, or it's going to give me a sense of achievement. And then when I asked later, a similar question about, well, why do you keep doing this? There was a pretty sizable shift there, where now 69% of responses cited words related to these domains related to PERMA, of things like, I feel, it's good for my mental health. I feel more positive. I feel like a sense of achievement or accomplishment. And then there was a decrease, and it was down to 37% cited words related to convenience. So obviously the convenience piece is still there. It's still in your house. It's still, meeting your expectations. But I thought that was a really interesting shift to say something is happening that is actually shifting people to prioritize thinking about well-being in a different way, and also recognizing the benefits, these kind of things that, where in academia we've seen that there is importance to experiencing these elements of well-being, and now people are actually like being able to see them, which is why I kind of framed the study as like Peloton as a facilitator of hope, because it is facilitating these positive emotions and this sense of well-being. And so that was one of the shifts that I saw. And then, as we mentioned, I really wanted to understand why, like what's happening, what are the actual features that are, unlocking this for people. And so I'm happy to go into that. But
tell us.
Yeah. So there were kind of 5 main categories that people mentioned. And 3 were kind of far and above, and then the 2 were close behind. And so the top 3 were the instructor, which I think is probably no surprise. They're, almost like celebrities in the Peloton world. The second was metrics, which are anyone who has been a part of, used a Peloton. It's very clear to see right away, lots of different data points. And the third was music. And so those were the top 3. The other ones, there was like a sense of community, which was really important, and then class type, so the variety of different classes. But I can focus, I can go a little bit deeper into the instructor. Yeah.
No, take us through those. I think each of those has sort of fascinating sub-elements I'd love to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the instructor, and I'm curious, I know you said you're in early days, but have you found an instructor that you really like so far?
I'm still working my way through the list and discovering, and it's been fascinating for me actually, because I thought I had preconceptions, and some of those are visual preconceptions, and some of them are just kind of the name of the class, whatever. Yeah. And I think it's going to be like this. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it absolutely is not. So I've been constantly surprised. So it's been, from a psychological space, it's been really interesting, challenging my own I call it what it is, prejudices, right? And there's not necessarily sort of negative ones, but I kind of come along expecting a certain thing.
Yeah.
And then I get something that's slightly different. And I find that really interesting. So I'm still in that voyage of discovery. And of course, I've discovered that people in the beginner classes who seem nice and innocent have another side when they take you to a slightly more advanced level.
Yeah, you're like, that was very different than the 30-minute beginner ride when I start doing intervals with you.
Right.
Absolutely. And I think you're touching on something that's interesting that people talked about as well, which was naming that the instructor felt relatable was a big kind of keyword. There are like 3 big words that I pulled out. Was one, that the instructor was positive, was a big piece that people mentioned. The second was that they're uplifting, which I think is similar to positive, but slightly different about like how they're actually like making you feel. And then the third was this relatable component, which I think Peloton has done a fabulous job of trying to figure out, based off of your demographic, what is like, who is this instructor to you, and how are they going to be somebody that you feel like I could almost be friends with this person, right? Or this is somebody that I'd go and have a drink with, like that you feel some type of connection, even though they're on a screen and you're in your house. And where there's interesting research to kind of support this kind of finding about the value of instructors and sustained motivation and engagement is that specifically with exercise classes, but I also think this unlocks kind of a larger component when we think about leadership or management or coaching, is that words are really important, and that when instructors are using language that is supportive, individuals are more likely to not only come to future classes, but they're also more likely to just like be engaged in what that kind of experience is. And so I think sometimes we have this vision of like, I'm motivated by like the like in your face instructor who's like mean, and like that's what motivates me.
Sort of drill instructor type.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But even I think if you really, pay attention to this now when you're taking the next class, even when they're asking you to do something hard and have like a touch of that like in your faceness, there is tons of like positivity and uplifting and kind of like this like cultivating a sense of like belief in yourself, which I think connects back to that PERMA, model of meaning, of like kind of the like almost embodiment of like pushing past your potential. And so the instructors were the number one kind of motivator there.
I sense from what you're saying that they will have been coached in this. That this is, I'm not saying that the organization scripts on their behalf, because I think that would not make them authentic.
Yeah.
But there is very clearly a sense that the direction is the sort of tone that you ought to be adopting.
Sure. And I don't work for Peloton. I'm not sponsored by Peloton, so I don't totally know. But I have long had this before I even did this study, and would just get really enthusiastic about talking to Peloton with anybody. If you think about the amount of data they have on how you liked the ride. I mean, at the end of every ride, it pops up like, did you like this? Did you like the instructor? Like, did you like the music? How difficult was it? But then they also have your ride history, like how frequently are you riding and with who, your age, your self-identified, gender, and all sorts of different things to begin to, I'm not saying I think that the instructors are amazing in their own right, but they have a lot of data to say like, hey, your users tend to, be in this demographic and they really like this type of music. And when this class was really popular. So I think that they are intentionally thinking about how do we know our audience, which I think is a huge piece for any organization or any, manager at any level to be thinking about, how do I know my people and how do I know what works for them? And use that.
And it's as you were talking, it sort of occurred to me, it's a little bit like professional sportsmen and women, where the level of data, what they are doing on the pitch or in training is now monitored to the nth degree.
Right.
But this is a fascinating example where, yes, you've got data on me, but you've also got data on them and how they are making, what impact are they having?
Yeah.
And so it's a very interesting, so that would all then feed in to one, I guess, who you would hire in the first place
Yeah.
to do that role. But then secondly, as they're performing, you can you're getting almost, I mean, literally real-time data, but then also historic data around what impact they are having with the client.
Totally. And I have no idea what they're able to do, but you think about even all the interactions that happen during a ride. You can see people's heart rate. You can see how their output, how are they like actually following, are they listening to what the instructor said versus what the instructor didn't say to do? And even thinking about like, you know, people are, you know, you can give people high fives, like are people connecting with other people at certain points in the ride? So, you know, it'd be fascinating to think about how do they really connect the dots between how are people engaging in real time in the moment? How does that affect performance in the moment? Like, are there certain, you know, words? Are there certain types of, you know, exercises? And then you could, you know, look even longitudinally to say, well, what does that look like for future rides? Is somebody who, you know, responds to X more likely to do Y? And really kind of begin to build this experience. It's very different than if I just go to, you know, an exercise class in person. They have no data. They have no idea if I walk out that door and feel like, you know, $1,000, or if I walk out that door and I'm like, no, maybe I'll try that again. Maybe I won't. And so I think it really is an interesting model.
Wow. Okay, so that was it. That was it. I'd love to keep talking about this. We need to move on to get to cover the rest. So that was the instructors. Tell us about music.
Yeah, so music, you know, I think not surprising as we've seen an increase in kind of the types of classes that are themed by music, and different artist series that they're doing to kind of engage different, you know, types of musicians. But what the users kind of stated was the playlist was really important, the songs were really motivating, and seeing the variety. And so knowing that they had this choice, which I think if you connect to positive psychology, this element, or even when I was talking about hope theory, this element of like agency is a big part here, both with the instructor and music. You get to kind of pick your experience. It's not just like, here's the class that's at 5 p.m. Hope you like it. It can be, you know, whatever you want it to be, which I think is a huge component. And, you know, what other research talks about from a motivational perspective is that not only is like the tempo of the song an important motivator, you know, you can even like hop on, you know, different, whether it's Spotify or different apps now to figure out like tempo for pace of running. Like there's a lot of science behind like the beat of the music and then your likelihood to kind of like fall in line to that. But also there's research that supports that the words of the music can kind of elicit some motivational and more inspirational. And so I think being intentional about, you know, whether that's a song that has some personal meaning for you, that like, you're like, I remember this song from when I, you know, was back in the day and this really pumps me up. Or if it's like you really listen to the words of the song and it feels really motivating. And so I think music has both a kind of physiological kind of indicator for how we engage, and they are very intentional about thinking about how do we use that to motivate people.
Fascinating. And what was the third one? I forget.
The third one, so it was metrics, which was the second one. And I mentioned it a little bit in like all of the things that Peloton could probably do, but not surprising that we noticed that. And so things like the leaderboard. So if you don't have a Peloton, you can, you know, see exactly how you are doing compared to either anyone who's ever taken the class or people who are filtered to a certain kind of similar level to you. And people really, you know, name that as a source of motivation, as well as seeing their own output, which is the score that Peloton gives you for kind of the combination of your cadence and your resistance. So kind of how hard did you work in that class, and did you?
What have you put into this?
Exactly, and if that's kind of growing over time. So people like to track kind of, you know, am I getting better, or was that workout really as like great as I felt? And so being able to kind of see that. And then in general, with both of those things, it creates a sense of competition, which we know from the PERMA model, a sense of achievement can be a big source of motivation. So whether that's achievement that's with yourself, and seeing I reached kind of a personal record, or I did something that I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do, or literally just beating other people and feeling good about that.
But it's weird. But I find it fascinating because I get the competing with myself thing, and that's very powerful. I mean, when you're starting out, right, you're always getting past the best. Right?
Every time.
It's amazing every day. It's like, whoa, I'm incredible.
Yeah.
And then slowly those dry up a little bit. But I found myself kind of getting on, and I'm racing somewhat. I have no clue who they are. And I sort of look at it, I'm going to beat, I don't know who these people are. I have no idea what physical condition they're in. But it's amazing. It's this astonishing thing where I will catch that person.
Yeah.
And it's like a small child who gets very excited about it, but it works really powerfully.
Absolutely. And I think that's it's tied to that sense of achievement. And I think, I'll say, I think it's important. Anything that can be good for us, there's usually kind of like a downside to it as well. Even, positive psychology research on like strengths talks about we have strengths, but all of our strengths can also kind of have a bit of like a dark side to them, right? Like we can get ourselves in trouble if we don't recognize the fine balance between that. And I think competition is probably, and I'm not an expert in this, but has that similar fine line, right? Of like, competition is great when it's motivating you and pushing you forward, but also making sure that there's a healthy dose of competition there. But yes, there's research, obviously just to support that having that kind of constant feedback. One, going back to hope theory, that having feedback loops is a way to help us to stay motivated in our goals and kind of continuing to see, am I staying on the path that I identified, and how am I, seeing myself as capable of overcoming any obstacles that have popped up. But it also develops kind of intrinsic motivation. And so if we go to kind of self-determination theory and the idea of building more kind of like agency in ourselves, that kind of seeing ourselves as capable of reaching these goals or feeling that sense of achievement kind of builds that sense of self-determination and intrinsic motivation.
And you mentioned the social aspect, and obviously there's a social aspect with strangers where I can see people I will never meet. I don't know much about the tiny little snippets of data if they're prepared to share it with me, whatever they've called themselves on the thing, and then they're, maybe you get the male, female, maybe you get the how old they are and their location, and that's kind of it. But that gives you a sense of it. But obviously you can connect with your friends as well, and to sort of do proper social connection. And I wondered what, that leads us sort of neatly into that space that people looking from the outside will go, this looks a bit cultish. Yeah. And it seems like it's a bunch of sort of people that signed up to something. And I, that's one of the reasons I was sort of hesitant to beforehand, was to go, I don't want to join this kind of slightly weird, freakish fitness cult. And that put me off in a way. But having got into it, I love it. And it feels like a community. And I wondered what your thoughts were on all those things, because I can spin it both ways.
Sure. Yeah. And so the one of the next kind of layer of things that they didn't pop out as the most, significant things that people said motivates them, but was a close number 4 was community. Which, candidly, it did kind of surprise me, because I think of some of the things that you're mentioning, of that there is this real sense of community that people feel. I mean, Peloton, even as a company, brings, pre-COVID times, would bring people together, every year for an annual event, because they know that there's this sense of camaraderie that develops and shared kind of fandom, if you will, of this experience and wanting to talk about it. Which I think also motivated me to want to study this, because I would hear people on airplanes or at dinners or, in passing talking about Peloton in the same way that I was talking about with my husband. And it's like, oh, this isn't just me, like this is happening everywhere. And even similarly, when I was, studying and kind of beginning to think about this, I realized I was in a program we met once a month in Philadelphia. And so it was people from literally all over the country. We had people from the States, people from Brazil and China and all sorts of different places. And we realized we had been taking the same Peloton rides together for years, but never knew each other. But here we are in this shared class. And so it was a kind of a cool experience. But so I did unpack that a little bit further, because I was like, okay, this isn't coming up as one of the top things people say that's motivating them. But there is this through line in kind of all of these things, whether it's the instructor, like feeling a sense of connection to the instructor in some form, that's community, right? Like you feel this like connection, and now Peloton has those tags where like you can basically name like, this is my favorite instructor, so I'm now in this crew or this, pack or whatever that is. Like that's my community. There's also, when we think about the metrics and the leaderboard, like you said, that's a sense of community of like, am I riding with people who I've seen before, or am I beating a friend, or what does this look like? And they even integrated those like high fives in, so you can kind of connect with people in the moment who are doing this. So as I unpack this a little bit more, because I also had a theory that there's the difference between live and on-demand rides. So people can take rides that are happening in the moment, that are being live streamed from a studio in New York or London, or you can take them on demand, which have been pre-recorded, and you're just taking them, at a different time. And I personally love live rides. I'm very motivated by that, like accountability, the in the moment. And so my personal bias was like, oh, I bet there's something to unpack about like the difference in motivation that people feel between live and on-demand rides because of the sense of community. And what I found was no, people were equally motivated, whether they took live rides or on-demand rides, which I think part relates back to that sense of convenience, because it's about like what works best for you, and it can work either way. And as I unpacked it more, I realized that the sense of community is being built through these different kind of features of the bike to be both synchronous and asynchronous. So you can build this sense of feeling like you are a part of a community, that you are in shared relationship with other people, that you're competing against other people, no matter when you're taking this class. So there's the element of doing it together at the same time as everybody else. And there's this element of doing it on demand and seeing all these other people who have done it and being able to see how are you doing when other people were doing this at any other given time when they had taken the class. And so people did mention, when I unpacked community a little bit more, of saying, I talk about this with people outside of the experience. So this kind of exists even outside. Like even you're like, you reach out to me to say, I want to talk about this. There's this sense of like, I want to understand what's happening. And there's also this sense of like, in the moment, I can do these things like high fives. And so the synchronous and asynchronous form of community, which I think comes back to the value of relationships. When we feel like we have close relationships with people, it brings us a sense of connection and positive emotion. And so I see a real through line through all of it to say like community is a big, underpinning of it, but it's not what people are saying is like the motivating factor, but it's kind of like the through line and continuing to, engage people.
When you talk in those terms, I mean, I was sort of ignore the context.
Yeah.
A lot of the language that you've used, I mean, that points to, I used the word cult earlier, slightly jokingly and yet not.
Yeah.
But if I looked at sort of cults, religions, these sorts of, it seems to be playing very heavily in that space. Now, I don't think anyone is going to for 1 minute suggest that being in a sort of indoor cycling club, right, is going to be as anywhere near as bad as something that and it requires you to sell your house and go live on a mountain and hand your money over to some evil person, or it's not doing things that are bad for your body.
Yeah.
It's not indoctrinating people in a particular way, and yet the techniques that are deployed, in many cases, feel like they come from that. It's almost as if it's borrowed from religious or cult-like techniques to deliver some of these sensations.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always, it goes back to what I said about strengths. Like there's always, things that have upsides can also have downsides. And when we really understand people, I don't know if you're familiar with the book, I think it's called Against Empathy. And it basically talks about what is the downside of empathy. And like if we really understand people and how to empathize with them, what is the potential both on the upside and the downside?
What can we do with that?
Yeah.
Right?
And so I think, there's always that kind of, whenever anything is kind of tapping into human psyche and motivation, that there's always that element. But to what you also said, it's, if it's about people feeling connected, realizing kind of their full potential and feeling good about themselves, there's no harm to anybody else, but I hear you.
The bit I thought was interesting was obviously you're somebody that had it pre-COVID.
Yeah.
And COVID obviously just turbocharged this model, the business model, and the sort of acceptance of it. And people who, a ton of people. I'm late to the party by that piece, but I think it would have, it would have been much harder to get hold of one.
Yeah.
I think when I come early to the party, so in a way I'm pleased that
I
didn't. But when we look at that, a lot of people look at the person and go, oh, that only worked because of COVID.
Mm.
And of course, that COVID was definitely an accelerant of acceptance for the obvious reasons.
Sure.
But your research is basically pointing to something and go, actually, there is something here regardless of that. And yes, that accelerated it, but the underlying fundamentals were there already.
Sure, absolutely. And I think there's actually, I've started to, and I'd be curious on your reactions to this, to think about, in many ways, prior to COVID, Peloton was this intentional hybrid experience. And hybrid is like the buzzword now about hybrid work and what is this going to look like when people are going back to the office but still want to work from home. And the latest McKinsey reports talk about people like working from home, but they also feel really lonely, or they don't want to go back full time, but I want this flexibility. And so we're in this paradox of how do you have both? And so hybrid has become the answer for the time being. And prior to, if you go back into your Peloton class library, prior to COVID, there was always a live studio audience as well as the individual user at home. And I can, from personal experience, and I've been trying to unpack this in a way that I think can be useful for other people, but I, was captivated by this experience and couldn't wait for the day when I could go to New York and take a live ride. So I was like, oh my gosh, if this is the experience I'm feeling at home in my spare bedroom, what is this going to feel like when I'm in a room with, 30, 50 other people having this?
I mean, that literally, it's the pilgrimage to Mecca type of thinking, right?
Yeah, and so I finally had a chance to go, and I will never forget like the aha moment that I had where I was in the front row, ready to go. It's a full-on production studio, like lights, camera, action, go. And I realized there's a camera track above my head, and the instructor is 99% of the time looking directly in whatever camera is on. And in that moment, I realized this is mostly geared towards the people at home, which is another reason why I think it feels so good when you're doing it at home, is that when you look away from your screen for a second and you look back, they're looking at you. They even say sometimes, like, if it feels like I'm talking to you, because they're right there. And if I go to a fitness class, a spin class at my local gym, maybe I will happen to connect eyes with the instructor at a random moment, but probably not, just because there's so many things happening. But this intense focus on their largest audience, which they know is the hundreds of thousands of people who are at home, up to millions who are taking this, and the people who are in the studio, it's just, why not? We're filming a class. Why not have people come and be a part of the experience? I have realized that there is a lot of benefit to being there. I think it's fun. It's a shared experience. There's a collective energy. But there is this intense focus on who's at home, and how do we engage that audience? How do we give them shout outs and call them out? How do we say, I see you and I see what you're doing, and really make that shared connection happen? And so when I think about things like hybrid work and how do we apply this model into other places, I think there's a lot to learn from that about how are you really attuning your attention to your biggest audience, right? The people who are in the room and in the office automatically already have this shared energy. They're going to have these before and after moments that can't be recreated. They have the opportunity to directly talk to other people who are there. But recognizing you might have hundreds of thousands of employees who are not in that room, and how do you still make them feel seen and heard. And so I think that there's something really interesting about that dynamic of knowing your audience and making them feel seen in that process.
I think that's fascinating because it sort of reminds me, I mean, this is a TV production, right? That just happens to be streamed over the internet to a particular type of TV. Yeah. And so the production values and everything else is built around that visual experience. And I guess to your point, it's probably, I guess, ultimately the percentage of people that will be seeing the live show there is going to be, I mean, it's going to be sub 1%, right, like 0.0 whatever, right? Tiny number. Yeah. And that's not your target. And if you gave them a great experience to the detriment of people at home, right, that's not a sustainable business model.
Yeah. And so it's just, it's interesting to think about as, in many ways, when we think about Zoom and meetings that companies are having now, like they're becoming mini production studios in and of themselves. Like, how do I engage my, employees in a regular meeting when they're around the world? And I think that there's a lot to unpack from that.
So when we pull this whole thing together, if I said to you sort of what surprised you the most by the things that you discovered?
It's a great question. I think I would sum it up by, one is what initiates behavior is not the same as what sustains it, which I think probably feels intuitive, but I think we often...
It's like any other human relationship, right? It's like
yeah, exactly. Yes. Totally. And so, we know this through many examples, but I think sometimes we forget that, whether it's rolling out a change in how you want to work with your team or an organization, or whether you're trying to shift behavior around something. We often forget, just because something's out the door doesn't mean it's done. Like, how do you actually continue to invest in people and keep them engaged? I also think that element of convenience is really an important factor when we think about how do you help people to get over that hump of recognizing convenience is such a big factor. And I think whether you're pitching an idea to a company, whether you're trying to motivate your employees, recognizing you've got to make this convenient. People don't like to be hit over the head with all of the here's all the benefits this is going to give to you. It's just more like, how is this going to work for me and why is that important to me? And then I think it's recognizing that well-being in the sense of positive emotion is a really important factor for sustained motivation. And so how do we unlock that in building experiences and opportunities for people to recognize why something is cultivating these experiences and these emotions for you, and then helping people to find those pathways. So I'd say initiating behavior is different than sustaining it. Start with convenience and then focus on kind of these elements of well-being as a way to sustain engagement.
And it struck me as the convenience thing is one thing, but sort of there is an embarrassment factor for some people in terms of walking into a gym, going for a run, doing any kind of exercise, because maybe their physical condition, maybe they don't, I don't know, they just don't want to be seen out there. They don't enjoy that.
Sure.
And so for me, it's a fascinating thing where I sort of think this has introduced a ton of people to an activity that if you said to them, you must go to a spin class, right, they would reel in horror at the idea of sitting there in front of other people and embarrassing themselves. And this removes a ton of that sort of angst that might be there as well. Was that something that came out in things people were saying? I don't know how people would articulate that, but it's an obvious point, but I could sort of see people, it's hard to express.
Absolutely. And I can't say that I saw it in any of the responses, but it is relevant to what kind of behavior change and motivational theory research tells us around people are, there's scales where people can, when they're engaged in kind of behavior changes, rate the negative perceived elements of it and the positive perceived elements. And people are more likely to, they really focus on the barriers rather than the positive elements. And one of the ways to kind of shift people is by slowly engaging them in the behavior so that those kind of barriers kind of start to fall off. And then they start to see the positive elements, which I think is kind of similar to what people were telling me about, start with convenience and then focus on these elements of well-being. And similar to what you're saying, can I do this in a safe, controlled environment and warm up to it. And then once I realize the full benefits of it, now I might be willing to actually kind of go and do more things or focus on kind of well-being in other domains of my life. And so I do think that there's a big element here of this experience is, in early Peloton days, they had like a marketing campaign that was like hashtag more than a bike, basically saying like, this is more than just an experience, like just a workout. And I think what part of that is saying is that by engaging in these positive behaviors, you're more likely to be open to doing other things too, right? I might be more likely to feel confident to take on a new work challenge, or I might be more confident to work out in other places, or prioritize well-being in other parts of my life. And so it kind of opens up the door to other opportunities.
Amazing stuff. I could keep talking to you forever because I'm absolutely fascinated by it. And I'm intrigued, what's sort of next in terms of research? Are you looking at doing any further research in this subject? Has this spurred other thoughts?
That's a great question. I think I am, like I said, I'm trying to think about right now, how does this connect to kind of the current realities that we're facing, and as we transition kind of into I hate to call it like a post-COVID time. I don't know what the right language is, but like as we transition to a new normal, I think is maybe
COVID 2.0 is where I go.
Exactly. Yeah.
On the basis that permits 3, 4, 5 and whatever else, because there's going to be some form of something going on, right?
Exactly. So what can we learn from that? And then just continuing to talk to people like yourself. I love sharing this, and I love talking about different people's experiences. And so we'll see where that goes.
Amazing. And look, finally, I've got to, and for anybody that doesn't have Peloton, this will make no sense whatsoever, but give us your favorite rides and recommendations for people that do have it.
Oh man, yes. So my favorite instructor is Ali Love. And so I'm a big fan of any of her rides. And man, my favorite rides to date, as a fan of the live rides, I get kind of this really like intense nostalgia for when I see these like pivotal moments of, oh my gosh, there's 30,000 people doing the same thing at the same time. This feels really cool. So most of my favorite memories are rides like that, when Peloton set like a world record for having like the largest class, which I think they've obviously surpassed now. But I'd say any ride with Ali Love, Alex Toussaint, those are some of my go-to favorites. So
amazing. Look, Lisa, thank you so much for spending the time and indulging my desire to talk about this thing that has become a key component of my life in the short time that I've had it. Thank you very much for exploring some of the topic, because I've learned a lot, and I know that it'll be fascinating for people whether they have a Peloton or they don't. I will put links to your research in the show notes so people can kind of dig into that. And there's also one or two articles I've seen you've written as well on it. So I'll put links to all of those things in there. But clearly, if anybody has any fascinating stories they want to share with you, they can clearly do that. I have a sense that this is going to be a continuing journey for you, and there's going to be more things coming. So I, for one, will be keeping a super close eye on it. I will look out for you on the leaderboard as well. I suspect I'll be miles behind for some time to come. But thank you so much for all of this.
Absolutely. And thank you for indulging me. I love talking about this. So I'm excited to keep the conversation going. So thank you.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Lisa for appearing, and to you for listening. To read Lisa's research on Peloton, have a look in the show notes. There's links to that and an article that she wrote about it there. If you're unfamiliar with the bike, you can find links to that in the show notes as well. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review for it, please do so. It really does help. To find out more about human risk, the work that I do with my clients to help them mitigate their human risk, have a look at human-risk.com. There you can find some resources, links to the Human Risk blog, video blogs, and newsletter. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. But in the meantime, safe riding, look after yourselves, and thanks for listening.